This is Chapter 53 of Pride and Prejudice, or Chapter 11 of Volume 3. Mr. Wickham was so perfectly satisfied with this conversation that he never again distressed himself or provoked his dear sister Elizabeth by introducing the subject of it, and she was pleased to find that she had said enough to keep him quiet. The conversation is the one that happened at the very end of the previous chapter, 52, where Wickham tries to get Elizabeth on his side again about the living that he didn't have and how dare Mr. Darcy and how Georgiana is so obnoxious, and Elizabeth just thwarts his attempt, doesn't get angry at him, but suggests that she knows enough for him to never bring it up again, which is good because it's really annoying. The day of his and Lydia's departure soon came, and Mrs. Bennet was forced to submit to a separation, which, as her husband by no means entered into her scheme of their all going to Newcastle, was likely to continue at least a 12-month. So they're not going to see Lydia and Wickham for at least a year. Mr. Bennet doesn't want to go and visit, so Mrs. Bennet's upset. "Oh, my dear Lydia," she cried, "when shall we meet again? Oh, Lord, I don't know. Not these 2 or 3 years, perhaps. Write to me very often, my dear, as often as I can, but you know how married women never have much time for writing. My sisters may write to me, they will have nothing else to do." Ouch, Lydia. So Mrs. Bennet says, "Oh, make sure you write." She says, "Oh, I'm going to be so busy because I'm married." And then she says, "My sisters can write to me." But apparently Lydia's going to be too busy being a married lady to respond to them, which is pretty harsh, especially when we know that Jane's had a really bad breakup in the last few months. Mr. Wickham's adieus were much more affectionate than his wife's. He smiled, looked handsome, and said many pretty things. He is as fine a fellow," said Mr. Bennet, as soon as they were out of the house, "as I ever saw. He simpers and smirks and makes love to us all." He just means, like, is very nice and pleasing. "I am prodigiously proud of him. I defy even Sir William Lucas himself to produce a more valuable son-in-law." So apparently Mr. Bennet is okay with Wickham now because he's been pretty reasonably decent when he visited. The loss of her daughter made Mrs. Bennet very dull for several days. "I often think," said she, "that there is nothing so bad as parting with one's friends. One seems so forlorn without them." "This is the consequence, you see, madam, of marrying a daughter," said Elizabeth. "It must make you better satisfied that your other 4 are single." So Elizabeth knows how Mrs. Bennet's obsessed with marrying them all off, and she says, "Well, you're not going to see us all the time if you marry us all off." Very witty again. "It is no such thing. Lydia does not leave me because she is married, but only because her husband's regiment happens to be so far off. If it had been nearer, she would not have gone so soon." So Mrs. Bennet does not get Elizabeth's sense of humor there, and she's also determined that Lydia wouldn't have gone away, and that marriage isn't a bad thing, even if she doesn't get to see Lydia quite as often. But the spiritless condition which this event threw her into was shortly relieved, and her mind opened again to the agitation of hope by an article of news which then began to be in circulation. The housekeeper at Netherfield had received orders to prepare for the arrival of her master, who was coming down in a day or 2 to shoot there for several weeks. Mrs. Bennet was quite in the fidgets. She looked at Jane and smiled and shook her head by turns. "Well, well, and so Mr. Bingley is coming down, sister," for Mrs. Phillips first brought her the news. "Well, so much the better. Not that I care about it, though. He is nothing to us, you know, and I am sure I never want to see him again. But, however, he is very welcome to come to Netherfield if he likes it, and who knows what may happen. But that is nothing to us. You know, sister, we agreed long ago never to mention a word about it. And so, is it quite certain he is coming?" "You may depend on it," replied the other, "for Mrs. Nicholas was in Meryton last night. I saw her passing by, and went out myself on purpose to know the truth of it, and she told me that it was certainly true. He comes down on Thursday at the very latest, very likely on Wednesday. She was going to the butcher's, she told me, on purpose to order in some meat on Wednesday, and she has got 3 couple of ducks just fit to be killed." So Mrs. Bennet's kind of going back and forth. She's talking to Mrs. Phillips, and she says, "I don't care if Bingley comes back, but is he coming? Really? Is he going to be here?" So she's going back and forth. We know that she really wants Jane and Bingley to be married, regardless of her anger at Bingley for really ghosting Jane. Mrs. Bennet had not been able to hear of his coming without changing color. Oh, sorry, Miss Bennet had not been able to hear of his coming without changing color. So Jane is blushing or going pale, nervous, excited that he's returning. It was many months since she had mentioned his name to Elizabeth, but now, as soon as they were alone together, she said, "I saw you look at me today, Lizzie, when my aunt told us of the present report, and I know I appeared distressed. But don't imagine it was from any silly cause. I was only confused for the moment because I felt that I should be looked at. I do assure you that the news does not affect me either with pleasure or pain. I am glad of one thing, that he comes alone, because we shall see the less of him. Not that I am afraid of myself, but I dread other people's remarks. So Jane tells Elizabeth when they're alone together that she's not blushing because Mr. Bingley is coming. She's only blushing because she was worried that everyone was going to look at her and start thinking about her and Bingley and talking about her. Elizabeth did not know what to make of it. Had she not seen him in Derbyshire, she might have supposed him capable of coming there with no other view than what was acknowledged. But she still thought him partial to Jane, and she wavered as to the greater probability of his coming there with his friend's permission, or being bold enough to come without. So Elizabeth doesn't know what to think. If she hadn't visited him in Derbyshire, maybe he is just coming back to Netherfield to go hunting. But now she wonders if maybe he is coming back because of Jane. She also wonders if, after her talk with Mr. Darcy and her comments during his proposal, she wonders now if Mr. Darcy gave Bingley his blessing to go back to Netherfield and win over Jane, or if Mr. Bingley is just brave enough to go back to Netherfield on his own without Mr. Darcy's approval. Yet it is hard, she sometimes thought, that this poor man cannot come to a house which he has legally hired without raising all the speculation. I will leave him to himself. So Elizabeth says he does legally rent Netherfield. It's tough. It must be tough on him that he can't just go to his house without people wondering, is he going to marry Jane? In spite of what her sister declared and really believed to be her feelings in the expectation of his arrival, Elizabeth could easily perceive that her spirits were affected by it. They were more disturbed, more unequal, than she had often seen them. So Jane is feeling nervous about Bingley coming back, even if she's saying that it's not affecting her. Jane really believes it to be her feelings, so Jane may really think, oh, I'm not going to be affected by this, but sometimes we think we're not going to be impacted by something, and then we find out that when it actually comes to that moment, we are emotionally affected. The subject which had been so warmly canvassed between their parents about a 12-month ago was now brought forward again. As soon as ever Mr. Bingley comes, my dear, said Mrs. Bennet, you will wait on him, of course. No, you forced me into visiting him last year, and promised if I went to see him he should marry one of my daughters. But it ended in nothing, and I will not be sent on a fool's errand again. His wife represented to him how absolutely necessary such an attention would be from all the neighbouring gentlemen on his returning to Netherfield. 'Tis an etiquette I despise, said he. If he wants our society, let him seek it. He knows where we live. I will not spend my hours in running after my neighbours every time they go away and come back again. Well, all I know is that it will be abominably rude if you do not wait on him. But, however, that shan't prevent my asking him to dine here. I am determined. We must have Mrs. Long and the Gouldings soon. That will make 13 with ourselves, so there will be just room for him. There will be just room at table for him. So now we're back where we were at the beginning of the novel about a year ago, where Mrs. Bennet is begging Mr. Bennet to go and see Mr. Bingley. Mr. Bennet says, I went last time. He didn't marry Jane. I'm not going again. Consoled by this resolution, she was the better able to bear her husband's incivility, though it was very mortifying to know that her neighbours might all see Mr. Bingley in consequence of it before they did. So Mrs. Bennet consoles herself that she's still going to invite Mr. Bingley to dinner anyway. As the day of his arrival drew near, I begin to be sorry that he comes at all, said Jane to her sister. It would be nothing. I could see him with perfect indifference, but I can hardly bear to hear it thus perpetually talked of. My mother means well, but she does not know, no one can know, how much I suffer from what she says. Happy shall I be when his stay at Netherfield is over. So Jane's upset that her parents are talking about this again. She knows her mom means well, but she is just nervous and upset by this whole situation. She just wants Mr. Bingley to be gone. Maybe. I wish I could say anything to comfort you, replied Elizabeth, but it is wholly out of my power. You must feel it, and the usual satisfaction of preaching patience to a sufferer is denied me, because you have always so much. So Elizabeth wishes she could help Jane, but she can't think of what to say, and she knows that Jane has to kind of work through this herself, and she would wish her to be patient, but Jane already is patient, so even that advice Elizabeth can't really give. Mr. Bingley arrived. Mrs. Bennet, through the assistance of servants, contrived to have the earliest tidings of it, that the period of anxiety and fretfulness on her side might be as long as it could. She counted the days that must intervene before their invitation could be sent, hopeless of seeing him before, but on the third morning after his arrival in Hertfordshire, she saw him from her dressing room window enter the paddock and ride towards the house. So Mrs. Bennet wants to find out as soon as Bingley's there so that her period of nerves can be as long as possible. So Jane Austen's poking fun at Mrs. Bennet again. So she's waiting, wondering when he's going to come, and then she sees him riding up to the house. Her daughters were eagerly called to partake of her joy. Jane resolutely kept her place at the table, but Elizabeth, to satisfy her mother, went to the window. She looked, she saw Mr. Darcy with him, and sat down again by her sister. "There is a gentleman with him, mamma," said Kitty. "Who can it be?" "Some acquaintance or other, my dear, I suppose. I am sure I do not know." "La!" replied Kitty, "it looks just like that man that used to be with him before, Mr. What's his name, that tall, proud man." "Good gracious, Mr. Darcy! And so it does, I vow. Well, any friend of Mr. Bingley's will always be welcome here, to be sure. But else I must say that I hate the very sight of him." So, Mr. Darcy is coming with Bingley. Kitty remembers him, Mrs. Bennet doesn't, and then Mrs. Bennet says, "I hate him, but since he's Bingley's friend, he can come in." Jane looked at Elizabeth with surprise and concern. She knew but little of their meeting in Derbyshire, and therefore felt for the awkwardness which must attend her sister in seeing him almost for the first time after receiving his explanatory letter. So Jane doesn't really know that Elizabeth's feelings about Mr. Darcy have changed. Elizabeth has not talked to Jane about this. So Jane just remembers the last news of Mr. Darcy as Mr. Darcy writing his letter explaining all of Wickham's past background and that side of things. So Jane has no idea that Elizabeth now likes Mr. Darcy and is in love with him. She just thinks that it's going to be really awkward for Elizabeth. Both sisters were uncomfortable enough. Each felt for the other, and of course for themselves, and their mother talked on of her dislike of Mr. Darcy, and her resolution to be civil to him only as Mr. Bingley's friend, without being heard by either of them. But Elizabeth had sources of uneasiness which could not be suspected by Jane, to whom she had never yet had courage to show Mrs. Gardiner's letter, or to relate her own change of sentiment towards him. To Jane he could only be a man whose proposal she had refused, and whose merit she had undervalued. But to her own more extensive information, he was the person to whom the whole family were indebted for the first of benefits, and whom she regarded herself with an interest, if not quite so tender, at least as reasonable and just, as what Jane felt for Bingley. Her astonishment at his coming to Netherfield, to Longbourn, and voluntarily seeking her again, was almost equal to what she had known on first witnessing his altered behaviour in Derbyshire. I think that's a typo, what she had known on first witnessing his altered behavior in Derbyshire. So Elizabeth does love him, and she thinks that maybe even if her feelings aren't as tender as what Jane feels for Bingley, remember Jane is always a little bit sweeter than Elizabeth. I think there's still a little bit of like a witty relationship with Elizabeth and Darcy. She does feel as intensely for Mr. Darcy as Jane must be feeling for Bingley. The color which had been driven from her face returned for half a minute with an additional glow, and a smile of delight added lustre to her eyes, as she thought for that space of time that his affection and wishes must still be unshaken, but she would not be secure. So Elizabeth is hoping that Mr. Darcy still likes her, but she's not certain. She's not 100% convinced. "Let me first see how he behaves," said she. "It will then be early enough for expectation." So she's going to observe. She sat intently at work, striving to be composed, and without daring to lift up her eyes, till anxious curiosity carried them to the face of her sister, as the servant was approaching the door. Jane looked a little paler than usual, but more sedate than Elizabeth had expected. All the gentlemen's appearing, her colour increased, yet she received them with tolerable ease, and with a propriety of behaviour equally free from any symptom of resentment, or any unnecessary complaisance. So Jane is pretty cool during this, doesn't react. She's a little blushy, but she's not as upset as Elizabeth thought she would be. Elizabeth said little to either as civility would allow, and sat down again to her work with an eagerness which it did not often command. She had ventured only one glance at Darcy. He looked serious as usual, and she thought more as he had been used to look in Hertfordshire than as she had seen him at Pemberley. But perhaps he could not in her mother's presence be what he was before her uncle and aunt. It was a painful, but not an improbable conjecture. So Elizabeth just talks to them as little as possible, but she's still polite. Mr. Darcy's not as comfortable or as friendly as he was in Pemberley, but maybe it's because Mrs. Bennet is there, and Mrs. Bennet does not always behave in a socially acceptable way. Bingley she had likewise seen for an instant, and in that short period saw him looking both pleased and embarrassed. He was received by Mrs. Bennet with a degree of civility which made her two daughters ashamed, especially when contrasted with the cold and ceremonious politeness of her courtesy and address of his friend. So Elizabeth watches Bingley, and he looks happy and embarrassed. He was just received by Mrs. Bennet with a degree of civility which made her two daughters ashamed. So Mrs. Bennet is being too polite to Mr. Bingley. She's a little bit over the top. And then by comparison, she's like cold and very formal with Mr. Darcy. So it's very uncomfortable the way that Mrs. Bennet is behaving here. Elizabeth particularly, who knew that her mother owed to the latter the preservation of her favorite daughter from irredeemable infamy, was hurt and distressed to a most painful degree by a distinction so ill applied. So Elizabeth knows that Mrs. Bennet's favorite daughter, Lydia, has been really saved by Mr. Darcy. He saved Lydia's reputation, made sure that this marriage went through, and Mrs. Bennet is being so rude and cold to him and doesn't realize that Mr. Darcy is the one who's responsible for really saving the family. Darcy, after inquiring of how Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner did, a question which she could not answer without confusion, said scarcely anything. He was not seated by her. Perhaps that was the reason of his silence. But it had not been so in Derbyshire. There he had talked to her friends when he could not to herself. But now several minutes elapsed without bringing the sound of his voice, and when occasionally unable to resist the impulse of curiosity, she raised her eyes to his face, she has often found him looking at Jane as at herself, and frequently on no object but the ground. More thoughtfulness and less anxiety to please than when they last met were plainly expressed. She was disappointed and angry with herself for being so. So Mr. Darcy asks about how Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner are doing, which Elizabeth doesn't really know how to respond to, because now Elizabeth knows that Mr. Darcy saw them in London and talked with them and facilitated the Lydia Wickham marriage. So she doesn't know how to answer that because Mr. Darcy knows how Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were doing more recently than Elizabeth does. So that's kind of a headache and a half. He's looking at Jane or at the floor and not really at her, so Elizabeth doesn't know what to think. He also is expressing or showing more thoughtfulness and less anxiety to please. By thoughtfulness, I don't think Jane Austen means like courteousness and thinking of other people. I think she means that Mr. Darcy is more pensive. So he's more like in his own head, and he's not as concerned about pleasing and being polite and friendly. He's still being polite, but not as friendly and reaching out as much as he was back in Derbyshire. Could I expect it to be otherwise, said she? Yet why did he come? So Elizabeth is disappointed that he's not trying to impress her, but then she's angry at herself that she's feeling disappointed. She wonders why he's there. She was in no humor for conversation with anyone but himself, and to him she had hardly courage to speak. She inquired after his sister, but could do no more. It is a long time, Mr. Bingley, since you went away, said Mrs. Bennet. He readily agreed to it. I began to be afraid you would never come back again. People did say you meant to quit the place entirely at Michaelmas, but however, I hope it is not true. A great many changes have happened in the neighborhood since you went away. Miss Lucas is married and settled, and one of my own daughters. I suppose you have heard of it. Indeed, you must have seen it in the papers. It was in the Times and the Courier, I know, though it was not put in as it ought to be. It was only said, lately George Wickham, Esquire, to Miss Lydia Bennet, without there being a syllable said of her father, or the place where she lived, or anything. It was my brother Gardiner's drawing up too, and I wonder how he came to make such an awkward business of it. Did you see it? So now Mrs. Bennet has to make it really awkward and bring up Lydia and Wickham's marriage. And she says that it wasn't as big of a newspaper announcement as it should have been. It wasn't a big announcement because Mr. Gardiner wanted to hush up the whole affair and be as brief as possible with the marriage announcement, but goes over Mrs. Bennet's head. Bingley replied that he did, and made his congratulations. Elizabeth dared not lift up her eyes. How Mr. Darcy looked, therefore, she could not tell. It is a delightful thing, to be sure, to have a daughter well married, continued her mother, but at the same time, Mr. Bingley, it is very hard to have her taken away from me. They are gone down to Newcastle, a place quite northward, it seems, and there they are to stay, I do not know how long. His regiment is there, for I suppose you have heard of his leaving the Blankshire, and of his being gone into the regulars. Thank heaven, he has some friends, though perhaps not so many as he deserves. So Mrs. Bennet said that Lydia went away. Again, she's just talking about this really awkward situation and not realizing how involved Mr. Darcy was with Lydia Wickham's marriage. Elizabeth, who knew this to be leveled at Mr. Darcy, was in such misery of shame that she could hardly keep her seat. It drew from her, however, the exertion of speaking, which nothing else had so effectually done before, and she asked Bingley whether he meant to make any stay in the country at present. A few weeks, he believed. So Mrs. Bennet says that Wickham has some friends, though perhaps not as many as he deserves. So Mrs. Bennet is now mentioning the fact that Darcy and Wickham are kind of enemies. Well, they're definitely enemies, but Mrs. Bennet doesn't know the extent of that. So she brings that up. Elizabeth is so embarrassed that she has to talk and change the subject now so that Mrs. Bennet can't go on. When you have killed all your own birds, Mr. Bingley, said her mother, I beg you will come here and shoot as many as you please on Mr. Bennet's manor. I am sure he will be vastly happy to oblige you, and will save all the best of the coveys for you. Elizabeth's misery increased at such unnecessary, such officious attention. Were the same fair prospect to arise at present, as had flattered them a year ago, everything, she was persuaded, would be hastening to the same vexatious conclusion. At that instant she felt that years of happiness could not make Jane or herself amends for moments of such painful confusion. So Mrs. Bennet's behaving awfully. Elizabeth thinks that if everything goes as it did the last time this all happened, it's going to end with the same upsetting conclusion that Jane and Bingley will not be married, and that nothing in years to come will ever make up for this awkward social situation. The first wish of my heart, said she to herself, is never more to be in company with either of them. This society can afford no pleasure that will atone for such wretchedness as this. Let me never see either one or the other again. So Elizabeth is done with Bingley and Darcy, does not want to see them again. It's just all too awkward and painful. Yet the misery, for which years of happiness were to offer no compensation, received soon afterwards material relief, from observing how much the beauty of her sister rekindled the admiration of her former lover. When first he came in, he had spoken to her but little, but every 5 minutes seemed to be giving her more of his attention. He found her as handsome as she had been last year, as good-natured, as unaffected, though not quite so chatty. Jane was anxious that no difference should be perceived in her at all, and was really persuaded that she talked as much as ever, but her mind was so busily engaged that she did not always know when she was silent. So even though Elizabeth is saying nothing will ever make up for this misery, it seems like Bingley is really liking Jane again. He keeps talking to her more and more as this visit goes on. Jane's determined that she'll act exactly the same. She's not talking quite as much, though, because she's also kind of stuck in her head, wants to appear exactly the same, but because she's so occupied, she's not thinking of things to say and conversing as readily. When the gentlemen rose to go away, Mrs. Bennet was mindful of her intended civility, and they were invited and engaged to dine at Longbourn in a few days' time. You are quite a visit in my debt, Mr. Bingley, she added, for when you went to town last winter you promised to take a family dinner with us as soon as you returned. I have not forgot, you see, and I assure you I was very much disappointed that you did not come back and keep your engagement. So Mrs. Bennet says, hey, Bingley, you promised you were going to eat with us and you didn't, and you said you'd come right when you returned, and now you've returned, so you owe me one. Bingley looked a little silly at this reflection, and said something of his concern at having been prevented by business. Then he went away. So Bingley is embarrassed and says, oh, your business kept me away, and then he leaves. And they then went away. Mrs. Bennet had been strongly inclined to ask them to stay and dine there that day, but though she always kept a very good table, she did not think anything less than 2 courses could be good enough for a man on whom she had such anxious designs, or satisfy the appetite and pride of one who had 10,000 a year. So although Mrs. Bennet is very proud of her meals that she serves, she doesn't think that she has anything quite good enough for Bingley, who she has anxious designs on, so who she still wants to marry Jane, or that she could satisfy Mr. Darcy, who is very proud and wealthy. And that's chapter 53.